let me just say that it's a great pleasure to be here with you. Tufts has an admirable reputation, and I must say that when I sat where you were sitting today, I wanted to go into the Foreign Service, and I assume that many of you want to go into the Foreign Service. But I had great difficulties because I couldn't pass the Foreign Service exam, being a recent Harvard graduate. So,
do you speak to the microphone?
Yes, I can speak to the microphone. I hope that is that any better? Doesn't seem to be from down here.
We're going to work. What I was saying is that instead of going into the Foreign Service, I eventually became a foreign correspondent and worked in Moscow for a period of 10 years, almost 10 years during the Cold War. And during that period, I got progressively fascinated by the North Caucasus. Traveled on several occasions to Chechnya, to Ingushetia, and most particularly to Dagestan, where I had a very good friend. I got more deeply into the Chechnya business when I met Dr. Hassan Bayev. And my wife and I have written this biography of Hassan Bayev, who was an extremely brave Chechen doctor and surgeon during the First and Second Russo-Chechen Wars. He basically treated anybody who needed help, and that included Russian soldiers, Chechen radicals, men, women, and children, with the result that he was hated by all sides. The Chechen radicals wanted to eliminate him because he treated Russian soldiers. The Russian military wanted to get rid of him because he treated Chechen radicals. He eventually came to Boston through an invitation by Physicians for Human Rights, and my wife and I wanted very much to meet this incredible Chechen surgeon, which we did. And we took him out to Concord to show him a little history of the American effort to separate from the great empire located in London. And during tea at the Concord Inn, he said, I also have a story to tell. And that was the beginning of our getting to know Hassan Bayev, getting to know his family, and starting to write this book. Now, the thing that really impressed me about the Chechens was that they come from a very distinct culture, which is very different from Russian culture. You shouldn't consider Chechens to be Russians. They've been dominated by the Russians, they will tell you, for about 400 years. And for about 400 years, they say they have objected to Russian domination, and they are thirsting for the moment when they too can become independent. And that moment seemed to come when the Soviet Union started falling apart in 1991. And at that time, as you know, the ethnic republics of the Soviet Union declared their independence and became independent. It was not so easy for Chechnya. Chechnya was not an ethnic republic in the sense that Armenia is an ethnic republic, or the Baltic states were ethnic republics. Chechnya was a large, or actually a small jurisdiction within the Russian Federation. And there was no provision for a part of the Russian Federation to secede from Russia. Nevertheless, at one point, Boris Yeltsin, who, as you know, was a rather mercurial figure, somewhat unpredictable, said something to the Chechens to the effect that take as much sovereignty as you can manage. And they did not hesitate. In November of '91, they immediately, or not immediately, but quickly declared independence. General Dudayev became president of this newly independent republic. And during the next little period, from 1991 to 1993, chaos essentially reigned. Chechnya was independent, but it attracted a lot of carpetbaggers, a lot of adventurers. There was kidnapping and various other unpleasant developments. And Yeltsin eventually said, we've got to put an end to this. We have to restore Russian constitutional order in Chechnya. And he then dispatched in tanks and in armored personnel vehicles many rather poorly trained Russian soldiers, many of them recruits. Now, what he didn't realize is that the Chechens are kind of like Spartans. They are very big on judo. They're very big on martial arts. They're very good with weapons, rifles and pistols. And they're also excellent at slaughtering sheep by cutting their throats. When these Russian soldiers in tanks and armored personnel carriers entered Grozny, they were picked off one by the Chechen sharpshooters. And in the course of a war that went on from 1994 to 1996, essentially they beat the Russian army, forcing the Russian commander, General Lebed, to hold ceasefire negotiations with Colonel Aslan Maskhadov that my good friend Brian has already described to you. Let me just say a word about Aslan Maskhadov because he's a fascinating character and also a principal in the latest book that I've been working on. Maskhadov, like Dudayev, was a high-ranking Soviet officer, which meant that the Russians had faith in him, that they trusted him, and he was known as a highly trained colonel who could be trusted to keep his word. The negotiations between General Lebed, the Russian commander, and Colonel Maskhadov, the leader of the Chechen military force, such as it was, from about 3,000 to 5,000 men, you're quite right. And it was a figure which was constantly going up and down because many of these so-called soldiers reverted to being civilian citizens at night, and then the next morning, or perhaps a week later, came back into the force. It was sort of a movable feast in that sense. But in any event, they came to an agreement, a ceasefire agreement, a disarming of the two sides, and a general agreement that in 5 years, that is to say by the year 2001, the actual political status of Chechnya would be determined on the long term. Now, in 1997, Maskhadov ran in the first and really only free and fair election that has taken place in Chechnya. It was an election which was monitored by the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. He won by a large majority, but it's also important to remember that although the Western world recognized this election, the Russian world never did recognize the election of Maskhadov as president. As time went on, things in Chechnya continued to be in turmoil. There were kidnappings, there were difficulties in the political leadership, so it was never very clear where Chechnya was going. Parallel to that, there were apartment bombings that started taking place in Russian territory, leading to the Russian claim that jihadists, terrorists, were trying to take over Chechnya completely, and that they were intruding onto Russian territory. Now, I will tell you that there is an American academic who lives in Massachusetts who served as something of a counselor to General Dudayev. And she and I interviewed Dudayev on a number of occasions by satellite telephone from her apartment in Massachusetts. And our constant theme to them was, do not intrude on Russian territory. Do not bring terrorism into Russia. because it will backfire on you. Well, as time went on, this advice was really not accepted. And what you find in the Chechen administration of President Maskhadov, you find a group of radicals challenging him for authority and for leadership. Maskhadov thought that he could get great help from the United States. He thought that if he could send his envoy to the United States, and you've seen a picture of him thanks to Brian, his name is Ilyas Akhmadov. Ilyas Akhmadov could persuade the Americans to help Chechnya, just as the Americans helped the Taliban in Afghanistan fighting against Russia. Now, it's interesting that Russian propaganda said that Maskhadov had employed a foreign minister who was an agent of Osama bin Laden. A total lie, a total lie. And I must say, Brian, I was impressed by your exposition of the lies that Soviet propaganda puts forward. I mean, they are just blatant. And how can you ever believe a power that talks in those falsehoods? And actually, I think we're seeing a little bit of that again in Crimea and Ukraine, but that's, I suppose, something for a little bit later on. What you should know is that the Russians also claimed that Osama bin Laden was pumping money into Chechnya in order to fuel this terroristic campaign against the Russians. There's actually not very much evidence of that. The foreign minister, Ilyas Akhmadov, whom Maskhadov sent to the United States, received from his boss $500 for his mission. $500. Of that $500, he gave $400 to his family, and he left with $100 in his pocket and the support of Chechen businessmen who then supported him for the next few years, traveling around Europe and traveling in the United States. One of the interesting things of that mission was that Maskhadov communicated with Ilyas Akhmadov largely through audio tapes, because the Russians were very constant at monitoring their telephone conversations. They had some telephone conversations, but mostly the interaction was through audio tapes. And the audio tapes were the mini kind, not the larger kind, because the mini kind you could hide in cigarette packs. They were easier to secrete. They were carried out of Chechnya by couriers. Some of those couriers were women that made it to Baku. From Baku, they were sent to the United States by DHL. And Akhmadov replied in the same fashion. There are 24 of these audio tapes. And what I have been doing with Akhmadov is translating the text of what Maskhadov was saying to Akhmadov and getting Akhmadov's commentary on each one of those. And that's all contained in this new book, which is called Chechenya's Secret Wartime Diplomacy. What did it amount to? Well, what's interesting about this correspondence is that this is the first time that you get an inside view of the thinking of the Chechen leadership and how it was going about its business. And here again, Brian has got it absolutely right. Maskhadov was interested in creating an independent state, a secular independent state. And that becomes very clear in these transcripts and the back and forth between them. But all sorts of problems arose because there were radical Chechens like Shamil Basayev who were joined by a Saudi Khattab, who were interested not just in creating a secular independent state, but as time went on, became more and more radicalized. So a question from the very beginning is, could you really use President Maskadov, the freely elected president of Chechnya, as a negotiating partner if he could not control the group of people who were leading the charge? So that was a question. Early on in the Second War, in the year 2000, there was some indication you find from these transcripts that Putin was willing to negotiate an end to the Chechen War. And that was particularly true through January of 2000. But in the beginning of February 2000, the Chechens began losing control of the city of Grozny, which was the thing that Maskadov thought was going to force the Russians into negotiations. That, plus the fact that the Russian army was not in very good shape, it was badly paid, it was marauding for food and so forth and so on. So Maskadov thought that the negotiation possibilities were pretty good in February. But then Basayev, who was leading the Chechen insurgents in Georgia, in Grozny, decided that he couldn't hold on any longer, and he led an evacuation out of Grozny. It was a very dramatic evacuation because it went over a snowfield during which people stepped on mines, and Basayev himself stepped on a mine and injured his right foot. And it is the Chechen surgeon, Hassan Bayev, who amputated his foot and saved his life. There was another element in the mission of sending Akhmadov to the United States, and that was that Maskadov thought that the CIA might well provide Chechnya with funds and money just as they had in Afghanistan. But what happened in 2003? The United States decided that it had to invade Iraq. And in Washington, the view, the interest in Chechnya shifted dramatically away from Chechnya. And I think Maskadov never really quite realized that America's interest was waning. Maskadov had thought that the United States, in searching for oil, would definitely come to Chechnya and Dagestan and seek to get to the Caspian Sea oil. But all of those thoughts were brushed aside when the United States went into Iraq. In any event, these negotiations these conversations between Akhmadov and Maskadov went on up until about the year 2008. And the situation got worse and worse. The Russians were constantly trying to find Maskadov and eliminate him. At one point, they offered him money and a plane to fly out of Chechnya to some other state. He refused. And finally, they discovered him hidden and were able to murder him. And that really, when he was murdered, that was the end of that organized resistance. I must say that in the course of all of this period, the image of the Chechens was very severely blackened, and it was blackened by events that you know about: the Nordost theater takeover in Moscow, the Beslan events in which the Russian school was attacked by insurgents. So even though at one point there had been reasonable people, moderate Chechen leaders who wanted to come to a sensible agreement with the Russians, all of that fell apart and came to naught. In the end, what the Russians managed to do was to Chechenize the situation in Chechnya. And a major part of the Chechenization was declaring Ramzan Kadyrov the new president. And Ramzan Kadyrov, who was actually a rather young man who spoke Russian badly, was bought off by the Kremlin, given sums of money for his loyalty. And Ramzan Kadyrov, who turned out to be actually quite a serious dictator and authoritarian, was able to stabilize the situation in Chechnya, was able to create for himself a very special lifestyle with many foreign cars, with a zoo with wild animals in it, and at the same time keep control of the situation in his country through very repressive measures. It is said these days that Chechnya is one of the more stable parts of the North Caucasus, but it has been at a very serious human rights price. Kadyrov is suspected of ordering the murders of various Chechen leaders who opposed him, but nevertheless he is there, and he has made the situation in Chechnya more or less stable. Although I know from my Chechen friends that there is fear, and people are afraid to talk frankly about what is going on there. Well, I've gone on, I think, long enough. I feel I haven't adequately made the difference for you between the Russians and the Chechens. Chechnya is a totally different society, has a different language. Chechens tend to be Muslims. And one of the things that happened as life went on was that the younger generation of Chechens, of which there are some in the Boston area, as you well know, the younger generation of Chechens are fed up with the older generation of Chechens, whom they consider to be corrupt. They consider them to be womanizers and drinkers and smokers and so forth. And all of that actually is quite true. And when you take a look at Johar Tsarnaev and his brother, you're dealing with a cat of a different color, because they're not truly Chechens, but one of the things that they have done by the bombings at the marathon last year is to have further blackened the image of the Chechens, whom I view as often very upstanding people, hard workers, who basically want to live a quiet and decent life. Well, we can get to more of that during the questions. Thank you.